The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida Department of State Division of Arts and Culture and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture. Carpenter Gothic style churches are typically characterized by wooden, board, and batten siding, pointed stained glass windows, pointed roofs, and spires with bell towers. More than 60 Carpenter Gothic churches were built in North and Central Florida in the second half of the 19th century.
If you see these churches, then you understand that they were built by a community that just had very little money. As it turned out, there was a kind of beauty in its kind of primitiveness.
Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The LaGrange Community Church in North Brevard County is an excellent example of a Carpenter Gothic-style church in Florida. The church was established on this site in 1869 as the first organized church on the east coast of Florida between New Smyrna and Key West. It's the oldest Protestant church south of St. Augustine. This Carpenter Gothic-style church is one of several dozen still standing in the state.
When you walk into the churches on the inside, they almost look crude because all the beams were exposed. And part of that had to do with not wanting to spend any more money than they had to on these churches. But the other, I think, is that these churches, rather than having too much ornamentation, that allowed for a concentration of the service and the congregation on a particular thing, rather than having a really ornate cathedral where everybody's looking around and paying attention to the architecture.
The principal designer of Carpenter Gothic churches in Florida was 19th century architect Richard Upjohn. He was part of the Gothic revival movement in America, first building small stone churches.
He came under the influence of what was known as the Oxford movement in the late 19th century that began in England. And the Oxford movement was a kind of restoration of the Gothic style of architecture because they argued that that was by far and away the most amenable to the whole concept of Christian theology. And so if there was a kind of movement which is called ecclesiology, in which they tried to match the church architecture with church liturgy and theology. That movement resulted in a large number of small stone churches being created in England at the time in the Gothic style. The Romanesque had been the most popular in those small churches before this. And then with some travel of Episcopals in this church over to England, they came back with the knowledge of what was going on there. And so Upjohn, as an architect, was very much influenced by it, and he built larger churches in the Gothic style. So Upjohn was part of a Gothic revival in churches in this country.
Richard Upjohn turned from designing stone churches to wooden churches, which worked much better for pioneers in the remote wilderness of Florida.
They were very, very simple to build, so that carpenters, all the carpenter needed was the design that he had presented to them, and they could build it. And so the result was that these little churches started popping up in New England, and later, as we'll see, down into Florida as well.
The LaGrange Community Church in North Brevard County is no longer used for weekly services, but is well maintained as an historic structure.
Anna Kokshuk started the first Sunday school in 1870, and she, after this church was built, she was a Sunday school teacher for 54 years and only missed one Sunday, and that was about a week before she passed away in 1924. Julia Ann Feaster, who had come here after the Civil War with her brothers and her two young sons, a Sunday school teacher, she taught here for 52 years. And Tom Johnson Kokshuk, who was a lay Baptist preacher and started the church, original church, he was superintendent here for about 27 years, taking care of the church and the school.
The LaGrange Cemetery is like an outdoor museum of local history. Civil rights martyrs Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore, who were killed when a bomb exploded under their home in 1951, are laid to rest here among early settlers who came to the area a century before.
Most of the early pioneers are buried in this cemetery. The oldest one is Andrew Feaster, who fought in the War of 1812, and he was the first one buried here in 1869. But many other people who were instrumental in settling of LaGrange and Titusville are buried here. Of course, Colonel Titus. Reverend Shadoin is buried here with his wife. The Mims family is buried here. Most of the Feasters are buried here. They were very instrumental in settling this whole area here. Froschner, who was the first undertaker here, he worked for DeBerry actually over in Stanford building houses and came here and decided to, out of necessity, to go into the undertaking business, and him and his wife are buried here. All the Carlyles came here in 1853 and settled on what they refer to as Carlisle Hill, which is just south of here.
Though these small Gothic churches were very simple, in the most of the Episcopal churches had enormous amount of symbolism, and sometimes they would hang flags on them with the symbols themselves. So places like LaGrange, all they needed was a simple structure, because at the heart of the LaGrange Church, there was a kind of a community church. The core of the service was the Word, whereas in the Episcopal Church, the central core was the mystery of the Eucharist.
Most of the Carpenter Gothic churches built in Florida were Episcopalian, but LaGrange Church was originally interdenominational.
Tom Johnson Kokshuk was actually a lay Baptist preacher, but this church was interdenominational because there were no other churches in the area. So what he did when he first formed the church, he would have the parishioners sign in what denomination they were, because this was serviced by circuit preachers. And so sometimes they would have a Methodist preacher stop by, Episcopalian, a Presbyterian, etc., etc. So it was interdenominational to start off with, and although he was a Baptist layman. Now, when Reverend Shadoin came, Reverend Shadoin was ordained Baptist pastor. So by then, though, what happened, this was the mother church of the other churches in the area. The Methodist Church downtown, St. Gabriel's Church, St. James Missionary Baptist Church in Mims, most of them extended from this church.
Bishop John Freeman Young of the Florida Episcopalian Diocese was responsible for most of the Carpenter Gothic churches that were built in the state.
He had traveled to England. He had become a kind of student of this ecclesiology of the Oxford movement, and was absolutely convinced that these were the kinds of churches that should be built by these communities when they were going to build them. And he traveled throughout the state, making certain in his mind that these congregations understood that these kind of churches were available to them if they wanted to build a church.
John Freeman Young, who was the bishop at the time, it was mostly his mission. He was the bishop of Florida, and he was determined to grow us. And I think what I didn't realize until I started doing a lot of research was he was getting pressure from the National Episcopal Church. And he was trying to prove that he really was working, that he just wasn't, enjoying the sunshine and fishing in Florida. And so they wrote journals. And one of the journals I ran across was from one of his missionaries that he sent down here. And the bishop was trying so hard to prove this, that he submitted this priest's journal to the national church. And in this journal, the priest talks about how he started up in Jacksonville, he had to come on the boat down to Enterprise, and then he had to wait, and then he got on another boat, which was called, I believe, the Little Addie, which he makes a comment that it was not designed for transporting people, and he had to sleep outside. It dropped him off at Salt Lake, and from there he walked carrying a valise of prayer books, and he was just kind of walking around being a little evangelist. And so he crossed through very treacherous territory. I mean, it's all swamp and muck and animals. I mean, he said he saw a tiger, but we're pretty sure it was a panther. But anyway, he walked all the way from Salt Lake to LaGrange, where he met up with some of the Carlisle family and made comments about them. They asked him to come back. And so he came from there, he walked into Titusville the same day, got here about sunset, because his mission from Bishop Young was to meet with Colonel Titus, because he knew that Colonel Titus was an Episcopalian, and have a service. It sounded like it didn't go that well, because Titus did not ask him to do a service. But his name was Reverend McClure. He spent the night, and then the next morning he walked back out to LaGrange and had the first Episcopal service there. He held a morning prayer service at 11 a.m. That was April 20th, 1869. And then from there he had more things he had to do. He was supposed to go out and see Douglas Dummett. And that, again, he had to navigate the Indian River, and then from there, after Dummett, he had to go up to New Smyrna. So I don't think people really realize what a true frontier that this place really was. I mean, everything was horseback and boats. And when John Freeman Young came back with another priest back in, I think, 1871, and it wasn't any better, he had to come the same way. So these people were determined to spread the word and to get their churches planted.
After the Civil War ended in 1865, Northerners from New England and New York began moving to Florida in large numbers. These new Florida residents brought with them progressive attitudes and a penchant for the Carpenter Gothic architectural style of the Victorian era. In dozens of new towns throughout North and Central Florida, Carpenter Gothic churches were built.
Back then, traveling through Florida was not easy. I mean, there weren't roads. A lot of it was by boat or steamship or just horseback. And so there weren't enough here to have anybody specifically dedicated to here. So for many, many years, we had traveling priests that would come and do the communion services. And then when they weren't doing that, then they would have what we call morning prayer that were led by deacons and people like that. What's interesting, though, is they met in homes, and they met in the Titus House Hotel, Wager House. And my great-grandmother told my mom a story that when they would come into town, this is while I think they were still living on the Gillespie grant, that she would bake the bread for the communion services. And I'm sure that all the families did that.
St. Gabriel's Episcopal Church in Titusville was built in 1887. The church is known for its unique stained glass windows.
We have what's supposed to be one of the finest collections of Victorian stained glass in the state, at least along the East Coast. The windows on the east side, right over the altar, those are responsible for the name of St. Gabriel's being St. Gabriel's. Originally, when the church was built, it was St. John's. And word got out that Mrs. Pritchard, not Mary Pritchard, but Colonel Pritchard's wife, who happened to be my great-great-grandmother, she was going to dedicate windows for the church that were St. Gabriel. And so when the congregation heard that, they decided to rename the parish from St. John's to St. Gabriel's. And so over the altar we have Gabriel, and then on either side, one is for her son and one is for her grandson. Really a good story about the window. That window is that the Carpenter Gothic, as you know, they tried to make them face east, so that when you looked at the altar, you'd be looking at the rising sun. When the sun comes through those windows, it makes Gabriel's robe shine. And it was so beautiful that when my mom got married, she got married at 7 o'clock in the morning in the middle of December. It was cold, just so she could see the light coming through that robe when she was getting married.
Another large stained glass window at St. Gabriel's commemorates Mills Burnham, keeper of the Cape Canaveral Lighthouse for 30 years, beginning in 1853.
In the west end, we've got a lighthouse window dedicated to Mills Burnham, who was Canaveral lighthouse keeper. And same thing happens with this one. As the sun sets, the light comes through the globe and looks like the light is actually shining. And then on either side of that, it's flanked by memorials to his family. We have any other memorials too. On the south side of the church, there is a window dedicated to Henry Titus, our founder. And then there are a couple windows on that side that were given by the Sunday school classes. The women took the time and worked and raised money to have those windows. And then on the north side, you've got a couple of the disciples displayed. And there's another window that's dedicated to Kate Gillespie Pritchard, who is Captain Pritchard's daughter. And that's actually the newest window because she died in the 1940s. And they took out a window that they didn't think was a memorial, and they put that one in.
St. Gabriel's is sort of unique in the sense that they have added on to it. It's much larger than actually those churches, than the ordinary church, for obvious reasons. As little towns grew, they needed larger ones. And sometimes these churches, when they would be added onto, would keep the central part of the old church.
You can still see the original footprint of St. Gabriel's Carpenter Gothic style church before it was expanded in the 1960s, and the enlarged space serves an active congregation.
That was when the space industry just started to explode, and we went from having, a very small congregation to a large congregation that couldn't accommodate the small size, the 100 people that would fit in here. And so they took a lot of time to try to maintain the integrity. What we did was they took the side walls and pushed them out to the north and to the south, and then in the back they pushed the back wall back towards the west. In that case, we added 2 doors. They basically deconstructed a lot of it. And during that time, we met over in our parish hall for services. We had fundraising, but it was primarily the expansion of the town. And it expanded our population, or our seating capacity, to about 200.
When the congregation of St. Luke's Episcopal Church on Merritt Island outgrew their available space, they decided to build a new church in 1978 while still preserving their original Carpenter Gothic Church.
The Episcopal diocese and bishops in this state were very, very good at saving these churches, and most of the time they would just build another larger church beside it and keep the one and still maintain it too, which is wonderful.
It was somewhat controversial at the time. It was always the possibility, well, we don't need it anymore, we don't really use it. But it is used fairly regularly, and there was a strong element of those original pioneers whose relatives were still in the area and still wanted to have this place where they were baptized and married and their families went here. So it was sustained, and in later years it was put on the National Register of Historic Places. So it's really a landmark for the ages, and we hope we can pass it on to generations to come.
Descendants of some of the original pioneer families on Merritt Island attend St. Luke's. The Sams, LaRoche, and Porcher families were some of the original settlers in the area.
It's around 1878 or so, the bishop of the Episcopal Church at that time, John Freeman Young, visited them with a couple of local clergymen and had services at Sam's house. They used the little cabin also for a schoolhouse, so it was a multi-purpose thing. In about 1886, Bishop Young approved the idea of building a church here. And so the land that the church sits on had belonged to a Canadian named Tiffin, and he sold the land to Mr. E.P. Porcher. But I think that it was donated for the church property use by Major Tiffin. He was an odd, eccentric gentleman who raised ostriches and had oriental plants, and his plan was to put in a hotel nearby.
St. Luke's is a prime example of a Carpenter Gothic church from the late 1800s with a simple but elegant design by Richard Upjohn.
It's a board and batten style generally for the siding. They're fairly simple, but they're kind of an elegant. The proportions were strictly by architectural standards, and so they're most attractive. Wood that was used was locally harvested. It's around here, it's called Merritt Island mahogany. It's a hardwood pine. A master builder, Mr. Higgins, in the town of Merritt, which is about 10 miles south of here, built the church. The LaRoche family had a sawmill, and we think it was locally milled, locally put together, and probably all of the labor was done by the people here in their spare time. Not a lot of spare time if you're a farmer, but it was a labor of love. They wanted this church. And it was, at that time, it was the center of their community.
This was the foundation of the community. It was the beginning of the community here, the settlement here, and it meant everything to the people. It was their meeting place, their school, their place of worship, their place of protection when they needed it. So it's so important today to protect and preserve these beautiful places because the stories associated with them are so important. And of all things, the children should know about their roots and what was here and the hardships and the happy times that people had, but how everything was developed through a community and involvement of the community. And it's very, very important all over to protect these places and to bring the rich history to the community.
For historians particularly, it is one thing to be able to look at a photograph and talk about it. It is another to be able to see that building and to talk about it and to give a kind of sense of what it's like by going in there and getting the feel of it.
Nearly half of the Carpenter Gothic churches originally built in Florida no longer exist because of urban sprawl, neglect, or natural disasters. Writer Harriet Beecher Stowe encouraged progressive Northerners to move to Florida. Although the original Carpenter Gothic church she helped to establish in Mandarin was destroyed, its more modern replacement was designed in a similar style. Following her death in 1896, the residents of Mandarin decided to honor Harriet Beecher Stowe and her husband Calvin with an original stained glass window created by Louis Comfort Tiffany.
He agreed to do the stained glass window in their honor, and it was very unique because it represented a secular portrait, not a religious one. And it supposedly is her view from her veranda looking out at the river. And so you have this beautiful moss and kind of the river and this very peaceful scene, but it was a secular scene. One of the stories was that they were having a hard time kind of visualizing the hanging moss. And so the ladies of the church actually packed up a box of moss and sent it to New York. So he hung it in his gallery so that they could really see how the moss hung. And so that window was at the Church of Our Savior from 1915 when it was installed until 1964 when Hurricane Dora came through here with fury and a hickory tree landed directly on the window and smashed it to smithereens. So we do have a few shards here. The church has boxes of shards. They weren't able to get anybody to put it back together, so it was lost. But it was a beautiful stained glass window, and people came to see it just because Tiffany did it, and because it was in honor of the Stowes.
Part of preservation, in my opinion, is to continue to use the facilities. And we have services here fairly regularly. We have a sort of a healing service that's done here, usually not heavily attended, a half a dozen people or 8 or 10 people. But it does sustain the interest in the building, and future generations are very interested in it. So we have a celebration here called Pioneer Day, which is the Saturday closest to John Sam's birthday. And we join up with the Sam's House, which is just north of here, and we and they celebrate the heritage of this church and that family and the pioneers that developed them here.
These buildings are part of Florida history. I mean, they're part of Florida's past, and they tell us worlds about what was happening in Florida in the late 19th and early 20th century.
When you think of Florida architecture, the first styles that come to mind are probably cracker architecture, Art Deco, or Mediterranean Revival, but several dozen Carpenter Gothic style churches still stand in the state as a quaint reminder of late 19th century Florida history. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida Department of State Division of Arts and Culture and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture.